The desert wind carried more than dust through Redemption Falls that scorching July evening. It carried secrets, whispers, and the kind of silence that makes honest men look over their shoulders. Cowboy Lonely rode into town as the sun bled orange across the horizon, his weathered face telling stories of 43 hard years on the frontier. His horse, a faithful mare named Justice, snorted nervously as they passed the first row of buildings. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you liked the story." Lonely wasn't his real name, of course. Thomas Mackenzie had died somewhere along the trail between Tucson and nowhere, buried beneath the weight of memories too heavy for any man to carry. The locals called him Lonely because he rode alone, spoke little, and carried himself like a man who'd seen too much of the world's cruelty. What they didn't know was that he'd been searching for something, not gold or glory, but a chance to balance the scales of his past. The town of Redemption Falls squatted in the valley like a wounded animal, its buildings sun-bleached and weary. The saloon's piano played a melancholy tune that drifted through the evening air, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of weathered wood. Lonely had seen 100 towns just like this one, places where people came to disappear or start over, where questions weren't asked and pasts were buried as deep as the wells. He'd planned to water his horse, grab a meal, and move on before dawn. That was before he heard the cry. It came from somewhere beneath the sheriff's office, a sound so desperate and haunting that it stopped him cold in the middle of the street. Justice's ears pricked forward, and even she seemed to understand that something was terribly wrong. The cry came again, a woman's voice, weak but unmistakably pleading for help. Lonely dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. The sheriff's office sat at the corner of Main Street and Justice Avenue, its windows glowing yellow in the gathering darkness. Through the glass, he could see Sheriff Briggs hunched over his desk, apparently absorbed in paperwork. The man was built like a bull, with thick arms and a neck that strained against his collar. His deputy, a nervous young man named Pete, sat cleaning a rifle in the corner. The cry came a third time, and this time Lonely was certain. It was coming from below the building. He approached the office casually, tipping his hat to a group of townspeople who were gathered outside the general store. Their conversation died as he passed, and he felt their eyes following him like vultures watching a dying animal. In a town this size, strangers were either opportunity or trouble, and Cowboy Lonely had the look of a man who could be both. "Evening, Sheriff," Lonely said as he pushed through the office door. The brass bell above the frame announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed obscene given what he'd just heard. Sheriff Briggs looked up from his papers, his small eyes taking in every detail of the newcomer. "Evening, stranger. Just passing through, I hope?" "That was the plan," Lonely replied, his voice carrying the gravel of too many campfire nights and too little sleep. "Heard this was a peaceful town." "Peaceful as they come," Briggs said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We don't get much trouble here in Redemption Falls. Folks mind their own business, if you catch my meaning." Deputy Pete looked up from his rifle, his young face pale and nervous. For just a moment, his eyes darted toward the floor, and Lonely caught the gesture. There was fear there, and something else. Guilt, maybe, or shame. "That's good to hear," Lonely said, settling into a chair across from the sheriff's desk. "Mind if I ask about accommodations?" The hotel looked closed. "Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house on Elm Street," Briggs said. "Clean beds, decent food. She'll treat you right, long as you don't cause any trouble." As if summoned by their conversation, another cry echoed from somewhere beneath their feet. This time it was weaker, more desperate, and it made the hair on the back of Lonely's neck stand up. Sheriff Briggs didn't even flinch, but Deputy Pete dropped his rifle with a clatter that rang through the office like a gunshot. "Sorry, Sheriff," Pete stammered, scrambling to pick up the weapon. "Butterfingers." Lonely studied both men carefully. The sheriff's face remained impassive, but there was something cold and calculating in his expression. Pete, on the other hand, looked like a man being eaten alive by his own conscience. "Sounds like you might have some kind of animal problem," Lonely observed casually. "Rats in the basement can make all kinds of noise." "Old building," Briggs said with a shrug. "Pipes make noise. Wood settles. You know how it is." But Lonely did know how it was, and the sound he'd heard wasn't made by pipes or settling wood. It was made by a human being in distress, and every instinct he'd developed over 4 decades of hard living told him that something was very wrong in Redemption Falls. He stood to leave, tipping his hat politely. "Much obliged for the information, Sheriff. I'll be heading over to Mrs. Henderson's place now." "You do that," Briggs said. "And stranger, like I said, this is a peaceful town. We aim to keep it that way." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Lonely had heard variations of it in a dozen towns, usually from men who had something to hide. He nodded politely and headed for the door, but as he reached for the handle, the cry came again, longer this time, filled with such anguish that it seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. This time Deputy Pete couldn't hide his reaction. He flinched visibly, his face going white as fresh snow. Sheriff Briggs noticed too, and his expression darkened. "Pete," he said quietly, "why don't you take a walk around town? Make sure everything's secure for the night." "Yes, sir," Pete replied, practically jumping to his feet. He grabbed his hat and headed for the door, avoiding eye contact with both men. Lonely stepped aside to let the deputy pass, and as Pete brushed by him, the young man whispered something so quietly that only Lonely could hear. "Cellar. Back of the building. Midnight." Then Pete was gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness like a ghost. Sheriff Briggs watched him go, then turned back to Lonely with that same cold smile. "Good night, stranger. Sleep well." Lonely left the office with his mind racing. He'd come to Redemption Falls looking for nothing more than a hot meal and a soft bed, but fate had other plans. Somewhere beneath that building, a woman was being held against her will, and the local law was either complicit or directly responsible. As he walked toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Lonely's hand unconsciously moved to the worn photograph in his shirt pocket, a picture of his wife and daughter taken just weeks before the Apache raid that had claimed their lives. He'd failed to protect them, failed to be there when they needed him most. The guilt had driven him to wander the frontier for 3 years, searching for some way to make amends for his failure. Maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found it. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that suggested a woman's touch. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a plump, motherly woman in her 50s who fussed over him like he was a long-lost son. She served him a dinner of beef stew and fresh bread, chattering about the weather and the town's upcoming harvest festival. But when he casually mentioned hearing strange noises near the sheriff's office, her demeanor changed instantly. The warmth left her eyes, and she busied herself with clearing dishes that didn't need clearing. "I wouldn't know anything about that," she said quickly. "And if I were you, I'd mind my own business. Some things are better left alone." What kind of things? Lonely pressed gently. Mrs. Henderson paused in her dish-clearing, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, he thought she might tell him something useful. Then she shook her head and hurried toward the kitchen. "I've got fresh coffee if you want some," she called over her shoulder. "But I'd recommend getting a good night's sleep. You'll want to be on your way early tomorrow." Another warning, delivered with motherly concern, but carrying the same underlying message as the sheriff's threat. Lonely was beginning to understand that whatever was happening in Redemption Falls, the entire town was either involved or too frightened to speak up. He spent the rest of the evening sitting on the boarding house porch, smoking and watching the town settle into an uneasy quiet. Lights went out one by one, and by 11 o'clock, the streets were empty except for the occasional stray dog or tumbling piece of debris. At 1:45, Lonely made his way back toward the sheriff's office. He moved carefully, staying in the shadows and avoiding the pools of light cast by the few remaining lanterns. The building was dark now, with no sign of Sheriff Briggs or anyone else. He found Deputy Pete waiting behind the building, pacing nervously near what looked like a cellar entrance built into the ground. The young man jumped when Lonely appeared, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Easy," Lonely whispered. "You asked me to come." Pete nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "I can't take it any more," he said, his voice barely audible. "What we're doing, it ain't right. It ain't human. What exactly are you doing?" Pete looked around nervously, as if expecting Sheriff Briggs to materialize from the shadows. "There's a woman down there. Been there for near 2 weeks now. Sheriff says she's dangerous, says she killed a man in cold blood. But I've seen her, talked to her. She ain't no killer. What's her name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. She came to town about a month ago, said she was looking for her brother. He'd gone missing and she'd tracked him here. But then—" Pete's voice trailed off. "Then what?" "Then she started asking too many questions. About the mine, about some of the men who'd gone missing over the past year. Sheriff Briggs said she was stirring up trouble, making accusations she couldn't prove." Lonely felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "What kind of accusations?" Pete was quiet for so long that Lonely thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with shame and fear. "Murder," he whispered. "She said someone in town was killing people and making them disappear. Said her brother had found evidence before he vanished." The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that made Lonely's blood run cold. A woman asking dangerous questions, a sheriff willing to lock her up without trial, a town full of people too frightened to speak up. "I need to see her," Lonely said. Pete shook his head frantically. "Can't do it. Sheriff's got the only key, and he checks on her every few hours. If he finds out I brought you here, then we better make sure he doesn't find out." The cellar door was secured with a heavy padlock, but Lonely had learned a few things during his years on the frontier that weren't taught in Sunday school. While Pete kept watch, he worked at the lock with a piece of wire, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of a man who'd had to improvise his way out of tight spots before. The lock clicked open after several tense minutes, and Pete nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he whispered. "How'd you learn to do that?" "Long story," Lonely replied, easing the cellar door open. "Stay here and keep watch. If anyone comes, you whistle twice." The stairs leading down into the cellar were rough-hewn wood, creaking ominously under his weight. The air below was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of dampness and human misery. A single oil lamp hung from a beam, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And there, In the far corner, he found her. Sarah Mitchell was younger than he'd expected, probably in her late 20s, with auburn hair that had once been carefully arranged but now hung in tangled strands around her face. She was chained to the wall by her ankle, the iron shackle already beginning to chafe her skin raw. Her dress was torn and dirty, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been pushed to the very edge of despair. When she saw him descending the stairs, she pressed herself back against the wall, fear evident in every line of her body. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying out for help. "I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to find my brother." Lonely approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. "Easy, miss. I'm not here to hurt you." "My name's Lonely. Thomas Lonely. Deputy Pete told me about your situation." Sarah's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Pete? He actually told someone?" "He did. And I'm here to help, if you'll let me." Lonely knelt down beside her, examining the shackle around her ankle. It was secured with another lock, this one newer and more complex than the one on the cellar door. "They said I killed someone," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Sheriff Briggs told the whole town that I murdered a man in cold blood, but it's not true. I've never hurt anyone in my life. Tell me about your brother," Lonely said gently, still working at the lock. "What brought him to Redemption Falls?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "His name is David Mitchell. He's a surveyor by trade, works for the territorial government. He came here 3 months ago to map some land for a potential railroad route. And then he disappeared? Not right away. He sent me letters at first, regular as clockwork, but then they stopped coming. When I hadn't heard from him for over a month, I got worried and came looking for him." Lonely paused in his work on the lock. "What did you find when you got here?" "Nothing at first. The sheriff said David had finished his work and moved on, but that didn't make sense. David would never leave without telling me where he was going. We're all the family each other has left." "So you kept looking?" Sarah nodded. "I talked to people around town, asked if anyone had seen him. Most folks wouldn't say much, but I got the feeling they were scared of something. Then I met an old prospector named Jake Henley. He'd been working a claim up in the hills, and he told me something that changed everything." "What did he tell you?" "He said he'd seen David up near the old Copper Creek mine about 2 months ago. David was with Sheriff Briggs and 2 other men, Mayor Caldwell and a man named Vincent Cross, who owns most of the land around here. Jake said they looked like they were having some kind of argument." The lock on Sarah's shackle was proving more stubborn than the one on the cellar door, but Lonely kept working at it while she talked. The story she was telling painted a picture that was becoming clearer and more disturbing with each detail. "Did this Jake Henley tell anyone else what he saw?" Sarah's face darkened. "He tried to, but 3 days after he told me about seeing David, Jake was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. Sheriff Briggs said it was an accident. Said Jake had been drinking and fell off his horse. But you didn't believe that. Jake Henley had been prospecting these hills for 20 years. He knew every rock and crevice like the back of his hand, and he never drank more than a beer or 2. There's no way he just fell off his horse." Lonely felt the lock mechanism give slightly under his ministrations. He was getting close to opening it, but he needed more information first. "What happened after Jake died?" I started asking more questions, being more direct about it. I went to Mayor Caldwell's office and demanded to know what had happened to my brother. That's when things got really ugly. "How so?" Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Mayor Caldwell got angry, said I was making wild accusations without proof. But then Vincent Cross showed up, and I could tell by the way they looked at each other that they were hiding something. Cross told me I should leave town for my own safety. Said Redemption Falls wasn't a healthy place for people who asked too many questions. But you didn't leave. I couldn't. Not without knowing what happened to David. So I kept digging. And that's when I found something that scared them enough to frame me for murder. The lock finally gave way with a soft click, and Sarah's ankle was free. She rubbed the chafed skin gratefully, tears of relief streaming down her face. "What did you find?" Lonely asked, helping her to her feet. "Papers," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength now that she was no longer chained. "Hidden in David's room at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson had kept his things, thinking he might come back for them. I convinced her to let me look through them, and I found his survey notes." "What did the notes say?" "David had discovered something about the land around Copper Creek Mine. Something that would have made certain people in this town very rich, and others very dead." Before Sarah could explain further, they heard Pete's whistle from above, 2 sharp notes that meant someone was coming. Lonely quickly extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the cellar into darkness. "Can you climb?" he whispered to Sarah. "I think so." They made their way carefully up the stairs, Sarah moving stiffly after 2 weeks of confinement. Pete was waiting at the top, his face white with terror. "Sheriff's coming," he hissed. "Saw his lamp about 2 blocks away. He's making his rounds early tonight." Lonely's mind raced. They needed to get Sarah away from here, but they also needed those survey notes she'd mentioned. And they needed to do it all without alerting Sheriff Briggs to what was happening. "Where are your brother's papers now?" he asked Sarah. "Hidden in my room at the boarding house, under a loose floorboard beneath the bed." "Pete, can you get us there without being seen?" The young deputy nodded, though he looked like he might be sick. "There's an alley that runs behind the buildings. We can take that to Elm Street." They made their way through the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. The town seemed even more ominous in the darkness, with every shadow potentially hiding an enemy and every sound potentially giving them away. Lonely found himself thinking about the photograph in his pocket, about the family he'd failed to protect. This time would be different. This time he wouldn't let an innocent person suffer while he stood by helplessly. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was dark and quiet when they reached it. Pete led them around to the back entrance, which Sarah said would be unlocked. Mrs. Henderson never bothered to secure it, trusting in the town's reputation for safety. They slipped inside like ghosts, Sarah leading the way to her room on the 2nd floor. The floorboard came up easily, revealing a small hiding space where she'd concealed her brother's survey notes and maps. "Here," she whispered, pulling out a leather portfolio. "This is what got David killed, and what they're trying to keep hidden." Lonely opened the portfolio carefully, squinting at the documents in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. David Mitchell's surveys showed that the land around Copper Creek Mine was sitting on top of one of the richest silver veins anyone had ever discovered. But according to the territorial records, that land belonged to the Apache Reservation, not to Vincent Cross or anyone else in Redemption Falls. "Your brother found out that Cross and the others were mining silver on Apache land," Lonely said quietly. Sarah nodded. "And not just mining it. They were selling it and keeping all the profits. David estimated that they'd stolen over $100,000 worth of silver over the past 2 years. That's enough money to kill for," Pete said, his voice shaking. "It's enough money to kill a lot of people for," Lonely corrected. "And I'm betting your brother wasn't the first person to disappear after asking the wrong questions." They were interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Henderson's voice called out, sounding frightened and confused. "Sarah? Sarah, dear, are you up there? Sheriff Briggs is here and he's asking about you." Lonely felt his heart sink. They'd been discovered, and now they were trapped on the second floor with nowhere to run. He could hear Sheriff Briggs's voice now, low and menacing as he questioned Mrs. Henderson about her missing guest. "Window?" Sarah whispered, pointing to the far side of the room. "There's a tree right outside. We might be able to climb down." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only option they had. Pete went first, his young agility serving him well as he scrambled down the oak tree's thick branches. Sarah followed, moving more carefully but managing to reach the ground safely. Lonely was about to follow when he heard Sheriff Briggs' boots on the stairs coming up fast. He grabbed David Mitchell's survey portfolio and swung his leg over the windowsill just as the sheriff reached the second floor. "Mrs. Henderson!" Briggs shouted. "Where is she?" Lonely dropped from the tree just as the sheriff burst into Sarah's room. They could hear him cursing and throwing furniture around, searching for any sign of where his prisoner had gone. "We need to get out of town," Lonely said quietly. "Right now, before he organizes a search party." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked. "He'll have men watching all the roads." "Not all of them," Pete said, surprising them both with his knowledge. "There's an old mining trail that leads up into the hills. It's rough going, but it connects to the main road about 10 miles north of here." They could hear Sheriff Briggs shouting orders now, rousing the town and organizing a manhunt. Lights were beginning to appear in windows, and the sound of voices carried on the night air. "Lead the way," Lonely told Pete, "and pray we can stay ahead of them long enough to figure out our next move." As they slipped away into the darkness, Lonely couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The survey notes explained why David Mitchell had been killed, but they didn't explain everything. There was something else going on in Redemption Falls, something even darker than theft and murder, and he had a feeling they were about to find out what it was. The mining trail was treacherous in the darkness, winding through rocky terrain that seemed designed to break horses' legs and riders' necks. Pete led them with the confidence of someone who'd traveled this path before, while Lonely brought up the rear, constantly listening for sounds of pursuit. They'd been climbing for over an hour when Sarah finally broke the silence that had settled over their small group. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves on stone. "Something I didn't tell you back in the cellar." Lonely urged his horse closer to hers. "What is it?" "The night before Sheriff Briggs arrested me, I met someone. A woman named Maria Santos. She worked as a cleaning girl for Mayor Caldwell, and she was terrified about something." "What did she tell you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if gathering courage to speak the words aloud. "She said she'd overheard a conversation between Caldwell and Vincent Cross. They weren't just stealing silver from the Apache land. They were planning to frame the Apache for a tax on white settlers, give the territorial government an excuse to move the entire tribe off their land permanently." Pete's horse stumbled slightly, and the young deputy had to fight to keep his seat. "Jesus," he whispered, "they're planning to start a war." "Not just start one," Sarah continued. "Maria said they'd already begun. 3 families have been attacked in the past 6 months, all of them living near the reservation boundary. The territorial newspapers reported them as Apache raids, but Maria heard Cross bragging about how easy it was to make it look like Indian work." Lonely felt a cold fury building in his chest. He'd seen the aftermath of real Apache raids, had lost his own family to one. The idea that someone would stage such attacks for profit was beyond evil. It was an abomination that demanded justice. "Where is this Maria Santos now?" he asked. "Dead," Sarah replied flatly. "Found floating in the creek 2 days after she talked to me. Sheriff Briggs said she'd been drinking and fell in. But Maria didn't drink. She was saving every penny to bring her family up from Mexico." They rode in grim silence for another hour, each lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about stolen silver or even murder. It was about a conspiracy that could lead to the slaughter of hundreds of innocent people. As dawn began to break over the eastern mountains, Pete led them to a small cave hidden among the rocks. "We can rest here," he said. "It's well hidden, and there's water from a spring." They dismounted and led their horses into the cave, which was larger than it appeared from the outside. Someone had used it as a shelter before. There were the remains of old campfires and some basic supplies stored in wooden crates. "Prospectors use this place sometimes," Pete explained. "It's been here as long as anyone can remember." Lonely was examining David Mitchell's survey notes more carefully in the growing daylight when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. According to the territorial maps David had been working from, the Apache reservation was supposed to extend much further east than anyone in Redemption Falls believed. "Sarah," he said quietly, "look at this." She came over to where he was studying the documents, and her face went pale as she saw what he was pointing to. "The town," she whispered. "Redemption Falls itself is built on Apache land." "Not just the town," Lonely said grimly. "The mine, the ranch lands, all of it. According to these surveys, the entire valley belongs to the Apache under the treaty signed in 1872. Pete had been watering the horses, but he overheard their conversation and came running over. "That can't be right," he said, looking at the maps. "My family's been here for 10 years. We bought our land fair and square from Vincent Cross. Cross sold you land he didn't own," Lonely explained. "And now he's planning to make sure no one ever finds out about it by getting rid of the Apache entirely." The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear now. Vincent Cross had been selling Apache land to white settlers for years, making himself rich while setting up a situation that would inevitably lead to conflict. When David Mitchell's survey threatened to expose the fraud, Cross and his allies had decided that the only solution was to eliminate the Apache claim to the land permanently. "We have to warn them," Sarah said. "The Apache, I mean. They have to know what's coming." "Warn them about what exactly?" Pete asked. "That a bunch of white men are planning to frame them for murders they didn't commit? You think they're going to believe us?" Lonely was studying the survey maps more carefully, looking for something that might give them an advantage. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "According to these notes, your brother found something else up at Copper Creek Mine. Something he called evidence of prior excavation." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "It means the Apache were mining that silver long before Cross ever showed up. If we can prove that, we can prove their claim to the land is legitimate." Pete shook his head. "Even if we could prove it, who's going to listen to us? Sheriff Briggs controls the law in Redemption Falls, and Mayor Caldwell has connections all the way to the territorial capital. We're just 3 people with a story nobody wants to hear." "Not nobody," Lonely said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "There's someone who might listen. Someone with the authority to do something about it." "Who?" "Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer at Fort Apache. I served under him during the war, and he's an honest man. If we can get this evidence to him, he'll act on it." Sarah looked hopeful for the first time since they'd met. "How far is Fort Apache?" 2 days hard riding. Lonely replied. But we can't just ride up there with a story and some papers. We need proof, real, undeniable evidence that Cross and his people are behind these attacks. What kind of proof? Lonely was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the possibilities. Then he looked up at them with a grim smile. We're going to catch them in the act. The plan Lonely outlined was dangerous and required precise timing, but it was their only chance to expose the conspiracy before more innocent people died. According to the survey notes, Cross and his men had been staging their fake Apache raids on a regular schedule, always during the new moon when the darkness would provide cover for their activities. The next new moon is tomorrow night, Pete said, consulting a farmer's almanac he'd found among the supplies in the cave. If they're planning another attack, it'll be then. How do we know where they'll strike? Sarah asked. Lonely spread out a territorial map on the cave floor, marking the locations of the previous attacks. Look at the pattern, he said. Each attack has been closer to the reservation boundary than the last. They're creating a trail of evidence that points toward Apache involvement. So the next attack will be even closer to the reservation, Sarah concluded. Exactly. And there's only one family living in that area, the Hendersons, who run a small ranch about 5 miles east of town. Pete's face went white. The Hendersons? But they've got 3 young children. Surely Cross wouldn't. Cross has already murdered at least 4 people that we know of, Lonely said grimly. I don't think he's going to draw the line at children. They spent the rest of the day planning their approach. The Henderson Ranch was isolated, surrounded by open country that would make it difficult to approach without being seen. But Lonely had noticed something on David Mitchell's survey maps that might give them an advantage. There's an old creek bed that runs along the north side of their property, he explained. It's dry this time of year, but it's deep enough to provide cover. If we can get into position before Cross and his men arrive, we might be able to document what they're doing. Document it how? Pete asked. Lonely pulled out a small camera he'd been carrying in his saddlebags. This belonged to a photographer I met in Tucson. He taught me how to use it before he died. If we can get pictures of Cross and his men staging an attack, it'll be evidence that even the territorial government can't ignore. Sarah looked skeptical. Will it work in the dark? The new camera plates are more sensitive than the old ones, and if they're using torches or lanterns, there should be enough light. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best they could do with the resources they had. As the sun set on their second day in the cave, they prepared to ride out and position themselves for what might be the most important night of their lives. Whatever happens, Lonely told them as they saddled their horses, we stick together. If this goes wrong, we'll all hang together, but at least we'll have tried to do the right thing. Pete nodded nervously, while Sarah just looked determined. She'd already lost her brother to these men, and Lonely could see in her eyes that she was prepared to risk everything to see justice done. As they rode out into the darkness, Lonely found himself thinking about the photograph in his pocket again. His wife and daughter had died because he wasn't there to protect them. But maybe, just maybe, he could prevent the same thing from happening to the Henderson family. The creek bed was exactly where David Mitchell's maps had indicated, and it provided perfect cover for their approach to the ranch. They could see the Henderson house in the distance, a warm glow of lamplight visible through the windows. It looked peaceful and safe, a family going about their evening routine with no idea of the danger that was approaching. Lonely set up his camera equipment while Pete and Sarah kept watch. The waiting was the hardest part, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, evil men were preparing to commit unspeakable acts in the name of greed and power. It was just after midnight when they heard the sound of approaching horses. Cross and his men were coming, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The riders approached from the west, moving with the practiced stealth of men who had done this before. Lonely counted 8 of them through his field glasses, all dressed in dark clothing and carrying weapons. In the moonless night, they were barely visible shadows against the landscape. Vincent Cross rode at the front of the group, his tall frame unmistakable even in the darkness. Behind him came Sheriff Briggs, Mayor Caldwell, and 5 other men that Lonely didn't recognize. They stopped about 100 yards from the Henderson house and dismounted, gathering in a tight circle to discuss their plans. "Can you hear what they're saying?" Sarah whispered. Lonely shook his head. They were too far away to make out individual words, but the body language was clear enough. Cross was giving orders, pointing toward different parts of the ranch and assigning positions to his men. "They're going to surround the house," Pete observed quietly. "Just like a real Apache raid would." "Except Apache don't usually attack at night," Lonely replied. "Cross is counting on people not knowing that." The conspirators began to spread out, moving to encircle the Henderson property. Lonely waited until they were in position before beginning to take photographs, using the brief flashes of lightning from a distant storm to illuminate his subjects. The camera's shutter clicked softly in the darkness, capturing evidence that would expose the conspiracy once and for all. Cross had thought of everything. His men carried Apache weapons, bows and arrows, war clubs and knives that would be left behind as evidence. They even had paint to mark their faces in the style of Apache war parties. It was a masterful deception that would have fooled anyone who wasn't watching it happen. The attack began with a war cry that echoed across the valley, a sound that made Lonely's blood run cold because he'd heard it before, on the night his own family died. But this time, he knew it was fake, a performance designed to cover up murder and theft. Cross's men charged the house from 3 directions, whooping and shouting as they fired their weapons into the air. The Henderson family's response was immediate and terrified. Screams from inside the house, the sound of furniture being overturned as they sought cover. "We have to help them," Sarah whispered urgently. "Not yet," Lonely replied, though every instinct was screaming at him to act. "We need more evidence first." John Henderson appeared at his front door with a rifle, firing shots at the attackers. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and Lonely could see that the situation was hopeless unless someone intervened. That's when Cross made his mistake. Instead of maintaining the illusion of an Apache raid, he began shouting orders to his men in English, directing them to specific positions around the house. His voice carried clearly in the night air, and Lonely's camera captured him in the act of orchestrating the attack. "Now," Lonely said, handing the camera to Pete. "Get this equipment back to the horses and be ready to ride. Sarah and I are going to even the odds." "What are you planning to do?" Pete asked. "What I should have done 3 years ago," Lonely replied, checking his weapons. "Protect innocent people from murderers." He and Sarah crept closer to the house, using the chaos of the fake raid as cover. Cross's men were so focused on their performance that they didn't notice 2 additional figures moving through the darkness. Lonely positioned himself behind a water trough near the barn, while Sarah took cover behind a woodpile. They had a clear view of the entire yard and could see Cross directing his men like a general commanding troops. "Henderson!" Cross shouted toward the house. "Come out and face your death like a man." "Go to hell," Henderson replied from inside, punctuating his response with another rifle shot. Cross laughed and turned to Sheriff Briggs. "Burn them out." Make it look like the Apache got angry when they couldn't take prisoners. That was enough for Lonely. He stood up from behind the water trough and called out in a voice that carried across the entire ranch. "Vincent Cross, this is your only warning. Call off your men and surrender or face the consequences." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Cross's men stopped their attack and spun around, searching for the source of the voice. Cross himself looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe someone had discovered his secret. "Who's out there?" he demanded. "Show yourself!" Lonely stepped into the open, his Colt .45 drawn and ready. "The name's Thomas Mackenzie, but folks call me Lonely, and you're under citizen's arrest for murder, theft, and conspiracy to commit genocide." Cross recovered quickly from his surprise, his face twisting into a sneer. "You're that drifter from town. Should have minded your own business, stranger." "Maybe," Lonely replied, "but I've got a bad habit of getting involved when innocent people are in danger." Sheriff Briggs raised his rifle, but before he could fire, Sarah stood up from behind the woodpile with a shotgun she'd taken from the Hendersons' barn. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff," she called out. "This scattergun will cut you in half at this range." The standoff stretched out for several tense seconds, with Cross's men looking uncertain about their next move. They'd signed up to stage a fake Apache raid, not to face down armed opponents in a gunfight. "You're outnumbered 8-2, Cross said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Even if you kill me, my men will finish what we started here." "Actually, it's 8-4, came a new voice from the darkness. John Henderson emerged from his house with his rifle, followed by his wife carrying a pistol. They took positions flanking Cross's men, creating a crossfire that would be devastating if shooting started. "And 8-5, said another voice. Pete appeared from behind the barn, his deputy's badge glinting in the starlight and his gun drawn. "Vincent Cross, Sheriff Briggs, Mayor Caldwell, you're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Cross looked around at his men, who were beginning to back away from the confrontation. They'd been promised easy money for a simple job, not a gunfight against determined opponents. "Stand your ground," Cross shouted at them. "We've come too far to back down now." But his men had already made their decision. One by one, they began laying down their weapons and raising their hands. They were hired guns, not fanatics, and they could see which way the wind was blowing. Sheriff Briggs was the last to surrender, his face twisted with rage and defeat. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled at Lonely. "This town will die without the mine. People will lose everything." "People were already losing everything," Lonely replied. "Their lives, their families, their honor. At least now they'll lose them honestly." Mayor Caldwell tried one last desperate gambit. "You can't prove anything," he said. "It's your word against ours, and who's going to believe a drifter and a crazy woman?" Lonely smiled grimly and held up the camera. "I don't think we'll have to rely on just our word." The photographs told the entire story. Cross and his men dressed as Apache, carrying weapons that would be left as false evidence, orchestrating an attack on innocent settlers. Combined with David Mitchell's survey notes and Sarah's testimony about the previous murders, it was enough evidence to hang them all. As the sun rose over Redemption Falls, a very different scene was playing out than Cross had planned. Instead of another family lying dead and the Apache being blamed for their murder, it was Cross and his conspirators who were facing justice. Pete had sent word to Fort Apache, and Colonel Morrison arrived with a full company of cavalry before noon. Lonely's old commanding officer listened to the evidence with growing anger, his face darkening as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Gentlemen, Morrison said to the assembled prisoners. "You've not only committed murder and theft, but you've nearly started a war that would have cost hundreds of lives. I can promise you that the territorial government will take a very dim view of your activities." The trial was held in the territorial capital, with newspaper reporters from across the region covering the proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury took less than an hour to reach their verdict. Vincent Cross, Sheriff Briggs, and Mayor Caldwell were sentenced to hang for murder and conspiracy. Their accomplices received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. The stolen silver was returned to the Apache tribe, along with formal recognition of their land rights. But perhaps the most important outcome was the change that came over Redemption Falls itself. With the truth finally exposed, the town began the long process of healing and rebuilding. New leadership emerged, honest men and women who were committed to making amends for the crimes that had been committed in their name. Pete was appointed as the new sheriff, a position he accepted with the promise to always put justice before politics. Mrs. Henderson was elected mayor, running on a platform of transparency and cooperation with the Apache tribe. Sarah Mitchell used her brother's survey notes to establish a new mining operation, this one operating legally on land purchased fairly from the territorial government. She hired many of the townspeople who had lost their jobs when Cross's illegal operation was shut down, giving them a chance to earn an honest living. As for Lonely, he found something in Redemption Falls that he'd been searching for across the frontier for 3 years, a sense of peace with his past and hope for his future. The photograph in his pocket would always remind him of the family he'd lost, but now it also reminded him of the family he'd helped save. On a warm evening, 6 months after the trial, Lonely sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over a town that had truly earned its name. Sarah joined him, as she often did these days, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. Lonely considered the question carefully. "I used to think about it all the time, but I've come to realize that sometimes the place you're running to is the same place you're running from." "And what place is that?" "Home," he replied simply. "I spent 3 years trying to run away from the guilt of not being there when my family needed me. But I finally learned that home isn't a place you can lose. It's something you carry with you, and something you can build again if you're willing to try." Sarah smiled and took his hand. "I'm glad you decided to stay." "So am I," Lonely said, squeezing her hand gently. "So am I." In the distance, they could hear the sound of children playing in the streets of Redemption Falls, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. It was the sound of a town that had faced its darkest secrets and chosen to build something better from the ashes of its shame. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Lonely Mackenzie felt like he was truly home. The legend of Cowboy Lonely's stand for justice would indeed echo through the canyons for generations, but not as a story of one man's heroism. Instead, it became a tale of how ordinary people could find the courage to do extraordinary things when faced with evil, and how a community could redeem itself by choosing truth over comfort, justice over profit, and hope over fear. As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and new beginnings, Redemption Falls settled into the peaceful sleep of a town with a clear conscience. And somewhere in the darkness, the spirit of David Mitchell and all the other victims of Cross's conspiracy could finally rest in peace, knowing that their deaths had not been in vain. Justice had come to Redemption Falls at last, carried on the shoulders of a lonely cowboy who had learned that sometimes the greatest victory is not in winning a fight, but in finding the courage to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.